Melissa stepped off the bus, her breath visible in the crisp Alaskan air. The small town of her youth lay before her, unchanged in appearance, but unfamiliar after a decade away. Her heart ached with a blend of nostalgia and sorrow. She clutched the handles of her suitcase tighter, steeling herself for this new chapter. As she walked down the familiar streets, memories flooded back. The laughter of children playing in the snow, the warmth of her family home, all starkly contrasted with the cold reality of her return. She was no longer the carefree girl who had left to explore the world. She was a widow, a mother of two, carrying the weight of her past. "Mommy, are we almost there?" Her daughter, Lily, tugged at her coat. "Yes, sweetie, just a few more blocks," Melissa replied, forcing a smile for her daughter and son, Alex, who walked silently beside her, lost in his thought. They arrived at a modest house at the end of the lane where her parents awaited them. The reunion was bittersweet, filled with tight hugs and unshed tears. "Welcome home, Melissa," her father said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thanks, Dad. It's good to be back," Melissa replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother, a pillar of strength, took her hand. "You're home now. We'll get through this together." The next few days were a whirlwind of settling in and adjusting to their new life. Melissa found a job at a local company, a position far below her qualifications, but it was a start. The first day at work, she was a bundle of nerves. "Mom, you'll be great," Alex said at breakfast, his words offering more comfort than he realized. "Yeah, Mom, you're the smartest person I know," Lily chimed in, her enthusiasm infectious. At work, Melissa was greeted by a bustling office, a sharp contrast to the quiet of her previous life. She was introduced to her colleagues, a friendly group who welcomed her with open arms. Her boss, Brian, was the last to greet her. "Melissa, welcome to the team." "We're glad to have you on board," Brian said, his handshake. "Thank you, Brian. I'm looking forward to contributing," Melissa replied, meeting his gaze. There was a kindness in his eyes that put her at ease. As the days turned into weeks, Melissa found herself adapting to her new role. She was quick to learn and even quicker to impress, her dedication not going unnoticed. "Melissa, you've really taken to this job like a fish to water," Brian remarked one afternoon as they reviewed a project. "Thank you. I've had a lot of practice being adaptable," Melissa responded, a hint of sadness in her voice. Brian's expression softened. "Life throws us curveballs, doesn't it? But it's how we handle them that matters." Melissa nodded, touched by his empathy. She felt a connection to Brian, a shared understanding of life's challenges. As she walked home that evening, the golden hues of the sunset painting the sky, Melissa felt a stirring of hope. Perhaps this return, cold and daunting as it had seemed, was the beginning of something new, a path to healing and rediscovering herself. The weight of her past still lingered, but in the twilight of the Alaskan sky, she saw the promise of a new dawn. The Alaskan winter was unforgiving, but inside the office where Melissa worked, a different kind of chill was thawing. Her interactions with Brian, her boss, had begun to shift subtly from professional exchanges to something more personal, One late afternoon, as the office quieted down, Brian approached Melissa's desk. "You've been doing exceptional work, Melissa. How about grabbing a coffee to discuss the new project?" he suggested casually. Melissa hesitated for a moment, aware of the unspoken tension between them. "Sure, coffee sounds good," she replied, trying to sound nonchalant. At the cafe, surrounded by the soft murmur of other patrons, their conversation flowed effortlessly. They talked about work initially, but it gradually became more personal. "So, what brought you back to Alaska after all these years?" Brian asked, his eyes searching hers. Melissa sighed, a hint of melancholy in her voice. "Life didn't turn out quite as I expected. I lost my husband and realized I needed my family, the familiarity of home." "I'm sorry to hear that," Brian replied softly. "Life can be unpredictable. My wife and I..." Well, let's just say we've had our ups and downs too. The mention of his wife momentarily jolted Melissa back to reality, but the vulnerability in Brian's voice drew her in. As they spoke, Melissa felt a connection, a shared understanding of life's hardships and the longing for something more. As they walked back to the office, the cold air felt brisk, invigorating. Brian stopped, turning towards her. "Melissa, I know we're colleagues, but I feel like I can talk to you about things I can't share with others. It's refreshing." Melissa's heart fluttered at his words. "I feel the same, Brian. It's nice to have someone to talk to." The days that followed were filled with stolen glances and lingering conversations. Melissa knew she was treading dangerous waters. Her principals warned her against getting involved with a married man, her boss no less, but her heart was singing a different tune. One evening, as they worked late in the empty office, the tension reached a crescendo. Brian stood close to Melissa, discussing a report, but his proximity was electric. "Melissa, Brian began, his voice trailing off as he looked into her eyes. "Yes," Melissa prompted, her heart pounding in her chest. "I shouldn't say this, but I find myself thinking about you, even when I'm not at work," Brian confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. Melissa's breath caught in her throat. The confession ignited something within her, a forbidden desire she had been trying to suppress. "Brian, we can't," she whispered back, her resolve wavering. "You're married and Brian stepped back, nodding. "You're right. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that." The moment passed, but the spark had been lit. As Melissa lay in bed that night, she couldn't help but replay their conversation. She was drawn to Brian, to the possibility of finding love again, but the thrill of this newfound connection was shadowed by the moral implications of their growing attraction. In the quiet of her room, Melissa wrestled with her feelings. She knew she was standing at a crossroads, and the path she chose could change her life forever. The cold Alaskan night outside mirrored the turmoil in her heart, a storm of desire and duty threatening to break the fragile peace she had just begun to find. As winter deepened in Alaska, so did Melissa's internal conflict. Her affair with Brian had escalated beyond casual coffees and shared confidences, evolving into a secret romance. The office became their sanctuary, a place where stolen glances and subtle touches spoke volumes. The holiday season, however, brought a stark reminder of the reality they were both trying to escape. During a late evening at the office, as they were wrapping up a project, Brian stood up and stretched, his gaze lingering on Melissa. "Another holiday season. They always seem to come around so quickly," he said, a note of weariness in his voice. Melissa nodded, feeling a pang of loneliness. "Yes, they do. It's going to be a quiet one for me and the kids." Brian looked at her, a complex mix of emotions in his eyes. "I wish things were different, Melissa. I wish I could be there with you and your kids." Melissa felt a lump in her throat. "I know, Brian, but we both know that's not possible." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. They both understood the limitations of their relationship, the boundaries that couldn't be crossed. Brian had a family to return to, a reality that Melissa couldn't and wouldn't disrupt. The holidays were a lonely time for Melissa. While Brian spent time with his family, she was reminded of her own solitude. The joy of being with her children couldn't completely fill the void left by the absence of a partner to share these moments with. She found herself grappling with the painful reality of their relationship, a relationship that had no future. On a particularly cold evening, Melissa sat by the fireplace, her children asleep, the flickering flames casting shadows on her thoughtful face. The phone rang, breaking the silence. It was Brian. "Hey! I just wanted to check in. How are you holding up?" Brian's voice was soft, filled with concern. Melissa sighed, her voice a whisper. "It's hard, Brian. I'm trying to be strong." "I know, Melissa. I feel the same way." "I wish I could be there with you," Brian replied, his voice tinged with regret. But you can't, Brian, and we can't keep doing this. It's not fair to you, to me, or to your family, Melissa said, the realization hitting her like a cold wave. There was a pause on the line, heavy with the weight of their reality. I know, Melissa. I know, Brian finally said. The call ended, leaving Melissa in the silence of her living room, the fire's warmth doing little to comfort her troubled heart. She knew that their affair was a temporary escape from their respective realities. Brian would always go back to his family, and she would always be left alone, longing for a love that was never truly hers. Lying in bed that night, Melissa wrestled with her emotions. The affair with Brian had brought her moments of happiness, but it was also a constant reminder of what she couldn't have. She was living in a limbo, caught between her desires and her moral compass. As the night deepened, Melissa realized the cost of their love. It was a price too high to pay, a price that demanded her happiness, her peace of mind, and her self-respect. With a heavy heart, she knew what she had to do. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. She couldn't continue living a lie. The affair with Brian, no matter how much it meant to her, had to end. It was the only way she could start healing and find a way back to herself. The Alaskan winter seemed to mirror Melissa's inner turmoil as she grappled with the decision to end her affair with Brian. The days were short and dark, and the nights stretched on endlessly, much like the conflict that consumed her thoughts. One evening, after a particularly challenging day at the office, Melissa sat alone in her living room, the only sound being the crackling of the fireplace. Her children were asleep, and the quietness of the house allowed her thoughts to wander to Brian and his wife. She pictured Betty, a woman she had met only in passing, a kind face, unaware of the betrayal unfolding in her life. Melissa's heart ached with guilt. She thought of confronting Betty, revealing the truth about her relationship with Brian. She imagined the conversation in her mind, playing out different scenarios. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Startled, she stood up to find Brian standing outside, his face etched with worry. "Brian, what are you doing here?" Melissa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I needed to see you, Melissa. I can't keep pretending everything is okay," Brian said, stepping in. They sat opposite each other, the tension palpable in the air. "Brian, I've been thinking about everything. We can't keep doing this." "It's not right," Melissa started, her voice shaking. "I know, Melissa, but I can't help how I feel about you," Brian replied, his eyes filled with a mix of desperation and longing. Melissa took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I've thought about telling Betty. She does." Brian's face paled. "You can't, Melissa. Think about what that would do to her, to my kids." Melissa's resolve wavered as she saw the panic in Brian's eyes. She knew the revelation would shatter their lives, but part of her felt it was the only way to end things definitively. "I don't know if I can live with this guilt, Brian. It's eating me up inside," Melissa confessed, her voice breaking. Brian reached out, taking her hands in his. "Melissa, I'm begging you. Please don't do this. I'll end things with you if that's what you want, but don't destroy my family." The room was filled with a heavy silence as Melissa withdrew her hands, feeling a mix of sadness and frustration. "Okay, Brian, I won't tell her, but we can't see each other anymore. This ends now," Melissa said firmly, her decision clear in her heart. Brian nodded, his expression one of resignation and pain. "I understand. I'm sorry, Melissa. I'm so sorry for everything." With those words, Brian left, leaving Melissa alone with her thoughts. She knew she had made the right decision by not telling Betty, but it was a decision that came with its own burden. The weight of the secret they carried was a heavy one, and Melissa knew it would take time to heal from the scars of this affair. As she watched the embers of the fire die down, Melissa realized the complexity of love and betrayal. She had chosen to protect Brian's family, but at the cost of her own peace. The path to healing would be a long one, but it was a journey she needed to take, for her sake and the sake of her children. In the quiet of the night, Melissa made a silent vow to herself to find a way back to who she was before the affair, to rediscover her strength, and to build a life filled with honesty and self-respect. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was determined to walk it with her head held high. The Alaskan winter was relenting, but the thaw brought no relief to Melissa's heart. Since her last encounter with Brian, she had been enveloped in a cone of introspection and melancholy. The decision to end the affair, while morally clear, left her emotionally fragmented. On a grey, drizzly morning, as she prepared for work, Melissa steeled herself for what she knew had to be done. She had to end things with Brian, not just for her peace of mind, but for the integrity of everyone involved. Arriving at the office, she felt an unfamiliar sense of detachment. The workspace that had once been a haven of forbidden love now seemed stark and sterile. She avoided Brian's office, her heart heavy with the burden of impending Mid-morning, Brian knocked on her door. "Melissa, can we talk?" His voice was tentative, a stark contrast to his usually confident demeanor. Melissa nodded silently, leading the way to a small conference room for privacy. As they sat across from each other, Brian broke the silence. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since our last conversation. About us, about my family." Melissa interrupted, her voice firm yet tinged with sadness. "Brian, I've made up my mind. We can't continue this way. It's not fair to anyone." Brian's face fell, a mixture of understanding and despair in his eyes. "I know you're right. I can't help but wish things were different." Melissa felt a surge of empathy for him, but she knew that sympathy couldn't guide her decision. "So do I, Brian, but wishing doesn't change our reality. You have a family who needs you, and I need to find a way to heal." There was a heavy silence, filled with the weight of unspoken emotions and shared memories. Brian reached across the table, his hand hovering as if to touch hers, but then he pulled back. "I always care for you, Melissa. You've meant more to me than you'll ever know." Melissa felt her eyes well up with tears. "And you to me, Brian. But this is goodbye." They stood up, the finality of the moment settling around them like a shroud. Brian gave her a long, lingering look, a wordless goodbye, before turning and leaving the room. Melissa sat back down, allowing herself a moment to grieve for what had been and what could never be. The affair with Brian had been a bittersweet chapter in her life, a chapter filled with passion, but also pain and deception. As she left the conference room, Melissa felt a sense of closure. It was a painful goodbye, but it was also a step towards reclaiming her life, her integrity. She realized that sometimes the hardest goodbyes were the ones that opened the... She walked back to her desk, her steps more determined. She had faced one of the hardest decisions of her life and had emerged with her principles intact. The road ahead would be challenging, but she was ready to walk it, one step at a time, towards a future where she could look at herself in the mirror without regrets. The affair with Brian was over, but Melissa's journey to self-discovery and true happiness was just beginning. As the harsh Alaskan winter gave way to the gentle embrace of spring, Melissa found herself emerging from the cocoon of her past. The decision to end her affair with Brian had left a hollow space in her heart, but also a sense of liberation. She was ready to embrace whatever lay ahead, however uncertain. Her days at the office became easier with time. The awkwardness around Brian gradually dissipated, giving way to a professional and cordial relationship. Melissa threw herself into her work, finding solace in her accomplishments and the respect she earned from her peers. One sunny afternoon, while Melissa was at a local cafe, her path crossed with Daniel, a fellow patron. He was around her age, with kind eyes and an easy smile. They struck up a conversation after a casual remark about the unusually warm weather. "Seems like the sun has decided to grace us with its presence finally," Daniel commented, taking a sip of his coffee. Melissa laughed, feeling an unexpected ease in his company. "Yes, it's about time. I was starting to forget what it looked like. Their small talk gradually deepened into a more meaningful conversation. Daniel shared his love for photography and his travels, while Melissa found herself opening up about her life, her children, and even her recent heartaches. I've learned that sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones that teach us the most about ourselves, Melissa said, a note of reflection in her voice. Daniel nodded in agreement. Absolutely. Life is a journey of finding ourselves, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. As they parted ways, Daniel hesitated for a moment before speaking. I don't usually do this, but would you like to meet for coffee again? Maybe this weekend. Melissa felt a flutter in her stomach, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. I'd like that, she replied, her smile genuine. Over the next few weeks, Melissa and Daniel saw each other regularly. Their conversations flowed effortlessly, and they discovered shared interests in literature, nature, and a mutual love for quiet evenings spent under the stars. One evening, as they walked along a scenic trail, Daniel stopped and turned to Melissa. You know, these past few weeks have been really special to me. I feel like I've known you much longer. Melissa's heart warmed at his words. I feel the same, Daniel. There's an ease between us that I haven't felt in a long time. Daniel reached for her hand, his touch gentle. Melissa, I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that I want you to be a part of mine. Melissa looked into his eyes, seeing not just the kindness she had come to admire, but also a promise of a new beginning. She squeezed his hand in affirmation. I'd like that, Daniel. More than you know. As they continued their walk, Melissa felt a sense of hope and excitement for the future. Daniel brought a new light into her life, a light that guided her out of the shadows of her past. The chapter with Brian was closed, but a new chapter with Daniel was just beginning. A chapter filled with possibilities, laughter, and genuine connection. Melissa realized that sometimes it takes walking through the darkest nights to truly appreciate the dawn of a new day. And as she walked hand in hand with Daniel under the canopy of the Alaskan sky, Melissa felt a profound gratitude for the journey that had led her here. She had found not just love, but a partner who reflected the best parts of her resilience, her passion, and her capacity for joy. With Daniel, she looked forward to writing the next chapters of her life, filled with the beauty of second chances and the promise of new horizons. Months had passed since Melissa had embarked on her new journey with Daniel. The Alaskan summer was in full bloom, the landscape a tapestry of vibrant colors and life. Melissa and Daniel were in her backyard, tending to the garden they had started together. The evening sun cast a golden hue over everything, creating a serene atmosphere. As Melissa planted a new row of flowers, Daniel came up behind her, wrapping his arms gently around her waist. This garden, it's become a symbol of us, hasn't it? Growing, flourishing, facing the sun together. Melissa leaned back into his embrace, a smile playing on her lips. Yes, it's our little piece of paradise. A place where we can nurture and grow, not just plants, but our lives together. Daniel kissed her cheek softly. I love you, Melissa. You've brought so much light into my life. Melissa turned around to face him, her eyes glistening with emotion. And I love you, Daniel. You helped me find a part of myself I thought was lost forever. They sat down on a nearby bench, hand in hand watching the sunset. The air was filled with the sweet fragrance of the flowers around them, a testament to their care and dedication. Remember when we first met, how uncertain everything seemed? Daniel asked, his voice reflective. Melissa nodded. I was so lost in my own turmoil. Meeting you was like waking up from a long, troubled dream. You showed me that even after the darkest nights, the sun still rises. Daniel squeezed her hand. We've both had our share of heartaches, but they brought us here, to this moment. I believe everything happens for a reason. Melissa looked at him, her heart full. You know, I used to think that my love for Brian was the end-all of my happiness. But now I see it was just a chapter in my life. A chapter that had to close for this one to begin. Daniel nodded, understanding. Sometimes the end of one story is the start of another, even more beautiful one. They sat in silence for a while, soaking in the beauty of the moment. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange, and Melissa broke the silence, her voice tinged with newfound wisdom. This journey, it's taught me about the resilience of the human heart, how we can find strength in our deepest wounds and hope in the most unexpected turns. Daniel looked at her, admiration in his eyes. You're an incredible woman, Melissa. Your strength, your grace through everything. It's inspiring. As the sky darkened, stars began to appear, twinkling like diamonds against the velvet canvas. Melissa and Daniel rose from the bench, hand in hand, walking back towards the house. Melissa paused, looking up at the stars. You know, in some way, I'm grateful for everything that happened. It led me here to a life filled with love, laughter, and the beauty of second chances. Daniel pulled her close, whispering, and I'm grateful for every step that brought you into my life. Together, they stepped inside, ready to embrace whatever the future held. Melissa's journey had been one of love, loss, and redemption, a testament to the transformative power of love. In Daniel's arms, she found not just a partner, but a soulmate who mirrored her truest self. Their love was a beacon, guiding them through life's complexities and joys, a reminder that in the end, it is love that heals, love that redeems, and love that makes life truly worth living.